Chapter 1. After the introduction, we simply need to find out what these instructions were given to the sons of Noah and what they represent in the principle of belief in the divine meaning. First, of wisdom. Just as they think that the 10 commandments that God gave to the people of Israel at Sinai are the entire Torah, so here too there are those who can think that all 7 instructions are the entire Torah. Obviously, this cannot be serious. It is impossible to include everything in 7 instructions. As complex as they may be, these instructions are actually heads of chapters from which other instructions are derived that translate these instructions into the language of action. Just as it is known that there are values and norms that create human behavior, when these serve as a mediator between the individual and society, and they constitute a channel of influence that contributes to the shaping of the value and cultural identity of the citizens in a given society, so that most people behave according to the norms. Does the company put in place any monitoring measures? As part of the supervision, the members of the company respond with sanctions for any compliance or non-compliance with the norm. Compliance with the norm by the individual leads to a positive reaction, and a third norm leads to a negative reaction. The question is, what is value? Value is a standard by which human behavior is measured. The value dictates the behavior of the individual in a certain situation of life. For every life situation, the culture dictates how to behave as an ideal, perfect, and correct way, for the culture itself. Each culture defines a large number of values, but not all values receive the same degree of importance in the eyes of that society. The value scale basically ranks the values of that society. At the top of the value scale were those values that are basic principles. If each society defines its own values and norms of behavior, then what is appropriate in one society will not be appropriate in another society. For example, a murder based on the honor of the family that certain communities practice will be perceived by another community as a murder for his name. This is because the value scale of the two communities is different. Therefore, the question arises again, are there absolute values? Obviously, to be of absolute value it must be outside the system of human communities. Because, as mentioned, what is perceived as permissible in one community will be perceived as forbidden in another community. Therefore, if there are absolute values, they must come from a source external to humans. In fact, these instructions are actually used as a concept of general absolute values that humans must uphold in order to compare the relative values of each and every culture with universal absolute values. In other words, when we look at God's instructions to the sons of Noah, we are convinced that these are instructions that are suitable for all people for several reasons. The first reason is that they were given by an external party to humans, and hence humans cannot influence the essence of these instructions. Another reason is that these instructions, as mentioned, dictate a way of behavior that is committed in order to carry them out. Another reason refers to these instructions as an absolute code that cannot be converted into an exchange system or due to negotiations characteristic of any given legal system. In light of the above, we can now see the meaning of each of the instructions given by God to all of humanity. The instructions of the sons of Noah, as suggested earlier, were the instruction not to worship idols, the instruction not to curse God, the instruction not to kill, the instruction not to condemn, the instruction not to perform incest, the instruction not to eat a part of the animal while it is still alive, the instruction to establish a court. When trying to understand the instruction not to worship idols, we can assume that it is not just a one-way instruction. That is, it is an instruction that consists of many variables that help us understand what things are supposed to mean. First, idols must be defined. Idols are also defined as foreign worship, idol worship, divination worship, or worship of stars and zodiac signs. They are terms that describe religious worship addressed to physical beings. Is that all it comes down to? In my opinion, no. There are many idols that even a religious person who believes in one abstract entity, such as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, can believe. For example, a person who puts his money as an idol to be admired, or a person who puts the act of sex as an object of admiration, or a person who admires and conducts a ritual of gambling games of all kinds. These are not idols. By any definition, anything that takes you away from the moral being you should be becomes idolatry. Thus, sex addicts, gambling addicts, and even work addicts are all accordingly idolaters. Don't want to present the negative pan like those addicted to murder and or addicted to robbery, who are also idolaters according to this definition. Hence the prohibition of worshipping idols actually tries to distance a person from any act that becomes excessive or obsessive, or a deviation that causes a person to forget and convert the main thing, the moral being in him, with the physical being that causes him to become addicted of any kind. In fact, any addiction of any kind leads a person to idolatry of any kind. Therefore, the prohibition here actually speaks of a prohibition to exaggerate anything that is done modestly, as opposed to things that are done ostentatiously with exaggeration or defiance in order to present some kind of performance, inevitably becomes idolatry, which this teaching completely forbids. In other words, in order to be more moral, subject to this instruction, we must give up all our bad habits that are addictive, and start living in what is known as the King's Way, the golden path, walking in the middle, not extreme to either side. Because the most logical interpretation would be if a person is addicted, or obsessed with variables that do not contribute to him, therefore these are idols, since it is well known to any reasonable person that idols are man-made that have no benefit, he simply engages in idolatry, and hence he has no desire to build a relationship of truth with God. Of course, there will be people who will ask if it is forbidden to smoke cigarettes. After all, such smoking is an obscene and addictive habit, and hence it will also be considered idolatry? Indeed, a very important question, and here too the differences between smoking and smoking must be emphasized. If a person smokes for pleasure, let's say after a good meal, but does not take advantage of this habit to smoke every so often and therefore eliminates boxes of cigarettes every period, then the person who smokes for pleasure, as explained above, in a measured and modest way, this is not a problem at all. Such modest and measured smoking will be part of the meal, as if an additional course in a meal is a sort of last course. Therefore, there is a difference between smoking for the sake of smoking excessively and smoking that complements the person's enjoyment of something enjoyable in itself, like a meal, for example. By the way, this approach should be the same for all other addictions that a person has, as mentioned, when the habit is not the addiction and does not become obsessive, but is done in a modest way from time to time. On honorable occasions it should not be harmful but becomes part of the human experience, which can even be spiritual in itself. At this stage, people can come and be harsh on us and then ask, in such a case, if a person steals once or murders once, will it be considered something modest? Indeed, a very interesting question, but in this particular case, there are two other instructions that cancel this in the first place: the instruction not to murder and the instruction not to steal. Specifically, these habits are not included in this provision at all.